Hi, everybody. It's great to see you and welcome to Stand With Us Connect. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are, all around the world. We're thrilled to be able to connect to you, and it's great to see you virtually speaking. I'm coming to you live from Israel, and it's the launch of Stand With Us Connect, our brand new webinar series. You know, Stand With Us has been at the forefront of getting Israel education in front of people all around the world in multiple languages, wherever they are. And in these challenging times, we wanted to make sure that we could bring Israel to you as well. So here we are, broadcasting live from Israel. And in a moment, I'll be able to introduce our keynote speaker who'll be addressing us this evening. It's going to be a fun, energetic, and interactive webinar, and we hope that you will join in with us. For future webinars, you can see the whole selection of what we're offering at StandWithUsConnect.com. Thanks once again for joining us. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker this evening. But what you should also know is that if you enjoy this session, you can book a webinar for your own group, a private webinar as well, via StandWithUsConnect.com. So if you like this and you want other sessions, you can book them all through our website. Okay, let's learn a little bit more. Tonight we're going to be talking about concepts and misconceptions of Zionism, Israel, and the Jews. And we're going to be led by our speaker, Charlotte Korchak, who is the Senior Educator and Director of International Student Programs at Stand With Us here in Israel. Charlotte graduated with a BA from Middle East History from the University of Southern California. She's been working for Stand With Us for many years. She was initially our West Coast campus coordinator, and then she made Aliyah. She immigrated to Israel and became the diaspora education coordinator. And in her current role as senior educator, Charlotte works with over 10,000 students every year from nearly every continent around the world at our Stand With Us Center in Jerusalem and all across Israel, training them to be effective activists in high school, universities, and communities worldwide. She has quickly become one of the foremost public speakers in her field, and I'm thrilled that she's going to be running our session tonight. Live from Jerusalem, please welcome Stand With Us is Charlotte Korchak. Charlotte, how are you doing?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm doing as well as you can be doing when you're locked in your house, but you know, we try. All right, so let's kick it off. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Stand With Us Connect webinar. I'm super excited to be kicking off this amazing new initiative brought to you by Stand With Us with the current reality, but also something that I think will carry over for many, many years as we move on from this reality. So first and foremost, just a little bit more about me and my background so you all understand where I'm coming from. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, so not a native-born Israeli. Like you heard from Michael, who's also a native-born Brit. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I lived there until I was 9 years old. And when I was 9, though, my parents decided to make Aliyah with me and my 4 older siblings. We moved to Israel. We lived in Israel for 5 years. Unfortunately, 3 years into our time in Israel, the second Intifada started. And that was really kind of my eye-opening experience into the conflict. The fact that I lived in a conflict, that there was a reality that I was kind of ignorant of. And it became very real when I lost 3 friends in one suicide bombing when I was 14 years old. And very soon after, unfortunately, my family actually had to move back to the US because the economy had crashed here in Israel. And so we moved back to the US. We moved from Jerusalem to Las Vegas, which was a weird move, the holy city to the city of sin. And didn't last there long. Ended up moving to Maryland, which is where I ended up finishing up high school. And then I went on to university. And to be honest with you, up until this point, here I am, basically 18 years old. I had been completely ignorant of Israel activism, of the fact that, you know, throughout the whole time that I was in high school, there was actually stuff that I could have done to help Israel while my friends were still living through the second Intifada, this big wave of terrorism that struck Israel. But I was unaware. Stand With Us barely existed at that point, unfortunately. Our high school department was 8 years away from being created. So I ended up going to university, and first 6 months, totally normal, average American college student, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. Second semester, an apartheid wall appeared on my campus. And I was very taken aback, and I had no idea what was going on. I didn't understand people who were attacking Israel. I didn't understand the accusations that were being made against Israel, like Zionism is racism, which was something that was written up there on that wall, and you know that there was a genocide going on here. And it was really it was really, again, an eye-opening experience. It was almost a slap in the face is usually what I call it, because it was this moment where I realized that I have to do something about this. And I think the worst part about it was I didn't know how to defend Israel. I didn't know how to speak up about Israel. I was, again, very ignorant of most of the reality. But even if you're aware of the reality, I think something that I've come to as an educator for StandWithUs and being an educator over the years is there's stuff that we know, but we struggle to how to convey it to other people. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight is not just facts. It's going to be about how we convey it to other people. How do we deliver that message to others? So let's start with, what are these claims that are being made? And I want to start with one core concept. That core concept is something that's going to be important and significant throughout this entire presentation. And that's defining one very important term. That term is Zionism. Now, it's not an easy term to define. It's one of those where there's a general definition, but there's also a personal definition that everyone who calls themselves a Zionist kind of feels differently about their Zionism and what that means. But I want to put out a general definition for what Zionism is. Now, before I even do that, because of this complexity, we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of different types of Zionism out there. The one that usually, when Zionism is used as a term today, the one that is usually used, the definition would be, it's what I would call modern political Herzlian Zionism. Now, this was the Zionism put forward by Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. And that modern political Zionism was, if we want to, let's define it, it was the striving for, or the support for, the establishment, or the support for an attempt to gain self-determination for the Jewish people. And eventually, very quickly, it will morph into for the Jewish people in their historic homeland. So let's say it one more time all together. Modern political Zionism is the fight for, and now the support of, self-determination for the Jewish people in our historic homeland. Now, that is, again, modern Zionism. And so one of the first things that we obviously have to point out here whenever we talk about Zionism and the Jewish people is that the notion of Jews returning to their homeland is not something that Herzl came up with. Right? This was a concept and ideology that had existed for 2,500 years. Let's go back very quickly into history. As we should know, the Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. We became a people in this land. Our language, our culture, our traditions all stem from this territory. So if we go all the way back, we suffered an exile after the destruction of our first temple. And in that exile, we had, again, the Jews in Babylon, in the area of what is today modern day Iraq, Mesopotamia, really yearning to return home. And that really was Zionism. That was ancient Zionism. Now, I want to make sure that throughout this presentation, when I talk about Zionism, I'm going to make sure that I emphasize which Zionism I'm talking about. Now, most of the time, I will be talking about modern political Herzlian Zionism, which again is the support for the striving for, the fight for, the support of Jewish self-determination in our historic homeland. Now, we have to quickly jump to something else, which is, today, Jews around the world, we make a statement. We say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So now let's define that term for a second. When we talk about anti-Zionism, okay, let's take the definition for Zionism that we threw out, which is the belief in and the support for self-determination for the Jewish people in their historic homeland. Well, if that's the definition of Zionism, then anti-Zionism would be somebody who is against Jewish self-determination in the historic homeland of the Jewish people, which is Israel. So, and this is why, this is the core reason why when we say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is because we kind of look out saying, well, why is it that when Jews are calling for their self-determination, that's not allowed? But for other people, it's totally acceptable. So anti-Zionism really, if we want to just break it down and make it simple, is somebody saying that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that the Jews shouldn't have self-determination in our historic homeland. And because that isn't a claim made towards anybody else in the world and really singles out the Jews, this is why this is anti-Semitism, or at least a form of anti-Semitism. Now, it's important to note, and we have to note just for a brief moment, that there are some Jews who are anti-Zionists. Now, for that tiny, tiny population in the world, and we're talking about a tiny portion of Jews, and let's remind ourselves, there are very few Jews in the world. We're talking about a tiny portion of Jews who say, we don't believe that Israel should exist for religious reasons. They are a minority of a minority. So let's acknowledge that 99.9% of the time that somebody's saying anti-Zionism, that somebody is an anti-Zionist, it almost always means that they're an anti-Semite. Okay? Now again, to somebody who's saying, I don't know if Israel has a right to exist, does that make them an automatic anti-Semite? Of course not. We have to have that conversation. And much of this session is going to be about how we have that conversation. What does that conversation look like? So we've defined Zionism. We've defined anti-Zionism. Now, I want to jump to those core claims, okay? Because there are claims made not against Israel. Let's make something very clear right off the bat. Criticism of Israel, of the Israeli government, of Israeli government policies is not anti-Semitism. And I have never heard anyone in my circle, in my sphere of Israel education and activism, claim that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. However, criticism of the existence of the state of Israel is anti-Semitism. And now what I want to dive into is those criticisms. What are people saying to try to justify the idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist? Now, I would say that there are probably 3 core claims that we need to go through. Okay, there might be others, I know, but I have noticed 3 core claims in the 10 years that I've been working for StandWithUs that have been constant. So let's start with the first one. The first one should be obvious, and some of you are probably already sitting there thinking, I know this one. And the argument is that we stole the land from the Palestinians, that we came in as colonialists in the late 19th century, and we started conquering this land and violently taking it from the Arabs who were living here. It's just far from the truth. And we have to call out a lie when it's a lie. And that's just not true. It's just not how that's not how the story goes. So let's go through it. First of all, the colonialist argument, which is another concept that we really need to debunk. The notion that the Jews were colonialists. Now, yes, you can comment about people back in the early 20th century calling what the Jews were doing colonies, that we were creating colonies. That was just the terminology of the time. But if you actually look at what this accusation is trying to put forward, it's by calling me a colonialist, what you're trying to say is that I am foreign to this land. Remember, I'm in Israel, and so when I say this land, that's what I'm referring to. So again, they're trying to say that I'm foreign to this land. And now this was the first thing that I mentioned. I'll mention it again, and I'll keep mentioning it. Because what we have to realize as Jews is that one of the more important things that we have to tell people when starting the story about Israel is that we are indigenous to this land. I'm not a foreigner. In fact, this shouldn't be that hard of an argument to make. Because for 2,000 years, when we lived everywhere else, that's when they called us foreigners. Because they knew where we were from. And in the times that we were living in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, you know, they always said to us, go back to Palestine. And of course, they were referring to Israel. They were referring to the ancient Judean kingdom. And, you know, when the Romans came in and changed that name from Judea to Palestine, it doesn't matter. But they were saying, go back to where you came from. So they knew it as well as we know it. But it's been forgotten now because of the Palestinian narrative. And so we have to go back and we have to remind people. First of all, don't call me a colonialist. It's incredibly offensive. I am not foreign to this land. I might look blonde and I might be white, according to what you would call me, but I am native to this land. Now, then we have to answer the question, then why am I a blonde white person saying that I'm native to the Middle East? Well, that's the next part of our story, right? I'm not a colonialist. In fact, I was the victim of colonialism. I was the victim 2,000 years ago when the Romans came in and took control over my territory, conquered it, destroyed the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, and then exiled the Jewish people. So I look the way that I do because 2,000 years ago, my people were colonized, and many of us were dragged to Europe. And so I look like I do today. And by the way, it wasn't just Europeans. Let's not forget, there are many Jews who, if you're standing having this conversation, you don't have to make the argument that I just made simply because you're not white. Right? We have Jews with lighter fair skin. We have Jews with darker fair skin because not only did Jews end up in Europe at the end during the Roman exile, we also ended up throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And eventually we ended up all over the world. And that exile is going to play a huge role in the story that we tell because it explains a lot of the complexity of the Jewish people, which is something by the end of this we will be able to flesh out and really be able to learn how to explain it all to somebody who's not Jewish. And for the non-Jews who are listening, this is really an amazing opportunity, because for the Jews who are, you'll learn how to explain it to others. And for those who are not Jewish, you'll learn for yourselves kind of how we see ourselves and what our story really is all about. So we ended up in exile. And that's why, again, I look like a colonialist, because I was the victim of colonization. So again, I would say to somebody, look, I'm really offended. And if you're really an anti-colonialist, you should be on my side. I'm against colonialism too. In fact, the Jews ending up back in Israel was really a justice in response to colonialism. Sure, it took 2,000 years. I get that. And by the way, I know that the next thing that somebody's going to say to you is going to be, but why did it have to be at the expense of another people? And I fully understand that question. So let's jump ahead. Let's go back to the stolen land argument. So we've established we're not colonialists. We're not foreign to this land. We're indigenous. We have been here for 3,000 years continuously as Jews, but most of us were living in exile, like I said, throughout the world. Now, let's get up to modern times. This argument that the Jews came in and stole the land. Well, let's talk about the journey of the Jews real fast into this land. And I'm going to tell a really brief history of kind of how the formation of the Jewish state and how it took place from the late 1800s to 1948. We had a reality where the Jews were suffering. The Jews in Russia in particular had suffered a pogrom in 1881. And it wasn't the first. And I think many of them thought it wasn't going to be the last. And it wasn't the first just in Russia. This was something that the Jews been suffering for 1,800 years, almost 1,900 years living in exile. The Jews were persecuted everywhere we went. And that's another incredibly important part of the story. It's indigeneity to then exile, to then within that exile, suffering through that exile. That wherever we went, we were second-class citizens and we suffered. I mean, how relevant for right now, right? We're going through a pandemic, and let's go back to another pandemic, 1347, the Black Death. And who was it blamed on? It was blamed on the Jews. And we were burned and we were massacred because they thought we were to blame. Nothing new is under the sun. And we're now being blamed for what's going on around the world. So we suffer persecution. And in 1881, we suffered a pogrom in Russia. Now, at that time, there had been a revival almost of Zionism, but not Herzlian Zionism. That wasn't around yet. Now we're talking about ancient Zionism. There's just this notion of, we keep suffering these persecutions, this inequality. Let's go home. And so in 1882, after that pogrom, we had the first wave of Jewish immigration, what we call the first Aliyah to Israel. And those Jews came in and they bought land in this territory. They bought it legally from Arab landowners who sold it to them. Sometimes they were absentee, sometimes they were present. And honestly, in the 1880s, we didn't have that much of a conflict or real tension between us and the Arabs. In fact, many of the Arab tribes living in the area actually welcomed the Jews in. And what happened? Herzlian Zionism is born. 1897, we have the first Zionist Congress that comes as a result of the printing of the Jewish state by Theodor Herzl in 1896, where he makes his plea. He puts political Zionism on the map and he says, the Jews need nationalism. The Jews need a country. Why? And for Herzl, it was simple, because of anti-Semitism. If you go and you read Der Judenstaat, it's short, you should read it. You have the time, you're sitting in quarantine or you're sitting at home as you should be. But read it, it's short, and read the beginning, because it's him just saying, anti-Semitism is here and it's going to follow us no matter what happens. Wherever we go, it's going to follow us. And so we need a place where we can go and be safe. And I really want to stress that for right now. I want to make sure that we understand that the root of modern Zionism, the root of us Jews rising up and saying, we need to have a state, was for one reason, because we need to survive. We need the ability to protect ourselves. And that's what we were demanding. After 2,000 years of persecution, that's what we were demanding. And so Herzl planted the bug in other people. And then there was another pogrom in Kishinev, modern day Moldova. And the Jews fled in 1904. And we have the second big wave of immigration to this land. Now many people are coming in with the Herzlian Zionist bug. They want to create the Jewish state. But the Arabs get wind of this. And this is really where we're going to start to see tension grow slowly, where they're sitting there saying, well, the Jews are now saying, not that just they want to live here, right? But just in the 1882, they didn't have this nationalism vision. They weren't coming in saying, we're going to create a Jewish country. They were just saying, we want to come, we want to live here. We want to work the fields here. We want to make this land flourish again, whatever it was. But comes 1904 and these waves start coming in of Jews saying, we want nationalism. And the Arabs react. And there's an Arab nationalism that starts to grow and starts to develop. And then the world changes. World War I hits. And this territory, which up until that point had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire, all of a sudden now falls into the hands of the British Empire at the end of World War I. Now, during the war, they had made promises. They made promises to the Jews, the famous promise in the Balfour Declaration, His Majesty's government views in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. You've got a year earlier, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, where the Hashemite tribe, the head of the Hashemite tribe, King Hussein, or Sheikh Hussein, comes forward and says, Sharif Hussein, comes forward and says, Palestine was promised to me. And the Jews say, Palestine was promised to us. At the end of the war, they got to figure it out. And the Balfour Declaration becomes law. When the League of Nations gathers these countries together in San Remo, and they draw up the British Mandate of Palestine. And what was written in the Balfour Declaration is adopted right into the British Mandate. It says that this territory is going to become a national home for the Jews, that the British need to encourage Jewish immigration and get Jews citizenship here. All good stuff for the Jews. But imagine you were an Arab and you're living in this land, right? Now, again, the Arabs, let's acknowledge something really important in terms of identity, right? Arabs at this time identified predominantly tribally. Okay, so you had the Husseini clan here in Jerusalem. You had the Nusaba clan here in Jerusalem. Up north, you had other clans. You had, the Zawabi clan and the Kabiyas, which were a Bedouin tribe. So nationalism is an idea. This notion of a national identity is growing. But the Arabs still, it doesn't matter national identity or not. It doesn't matter if they all called themselves in that moment Palestinians. The individual Arab tribes, Arabs living here, looked at the British and the League of Nations, and they were saying, what's going on here? We're the majority, and let's acknowledge the Arabs had been the majority for a very long time. We're the majority. The Jews are a minority. And now you're giving over land to the Jews? All of this land is now going to go to the Jews? How's that fair? And again, I really stress, and I want to keep stressing this, I think one of the best ways that we can learn is even if you stand very solidly on one side, try to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. And for the Arabs, they genuinely felt that their land was being stolen from them. Let's acknowledge when more and more Jews came in, they were buying land. They weren't forcibly kicking people off their land. That wasn't what was going on. That wasn't part of the reality. However, sometimes Jews would buy land. And when they would show up on that land, the Arab landowner who sold it to them lived somewhere else. And they showed up and they would find Arab families living on this land that they purchased. And they would have a very challenging reality where they would have to remove those families from land that maybe they had been living on for decades. According to scholars, they say about a few thousand families probably suffered this fate. And imagine, I'm a big believer, I struggle with people today saying like, there's your truth and there's my truth. No, let's not play fast and loose with the word truth. Okay, truth means something. There are facts. There is a fact on the ground. But let's also acknowledge that we are human beings, which means that facts are one thing, but how we perceive them is another thing. And so it's not your truth and my truth, but it is your reality and my reality. And those are two different realities. And so for the Jews coming in, they might have said, well, this is fair. I bought this land fair and square, and I paid probably an exorbitant price for it. But for the Arabs who were living on that land, they're sitting there going, but this is, I planted that olive tree. This is my home. And they felt like their home was being taken away from them. And that's how we get the start of that narrative of they came in and they stole our land. But that's not what happened, as we see throughout the story. That's just what they felt. Now, we get the British Mandate, and we're excited. The Jews are excited. People are starting to immigrate from Europe, not that many. As time gets worse, more and more. And by 1936, we have the largest amount of Jewish immigration. 66,000 Jews in 1 year. Boom. Where are they coming from? This shouldn't be hard to guess. They were coming from Germany. 1935, the Nuremberg laws had been passed. We shouldn't be surprised. Jews started to feel afraid. And that Zionist vision of Herzl saying anti-Semitism is coming and it's always been here and it's going to follow us everywhere we go. Well, the Jews in Germany said, yeah, we got to get out of here, some of them. But the Arabs living here, specifically the leader of the Muslim community in the British Mandate of Palestine, a man by the name of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, is very frustrated with that large Jewish immigration. So he launches a revolt in 1936, and it lasts until 1939. Why is this important? Because in 1937, the British tried to throw out the mandate. They proposed the Peel Commission. Now, the Peel Commission is something that if this is the first time you're hearing it, write it down, read about it, memorize it. Because the Peel Commission is going to be that first moment where the Jews realize, maybe we can't have all the land. Maybe there's another population here. We knew that there was another population. Don't get it twisted. Jabotinsky in 1934 wrote his constitution for what his vision of the future Jewish state was going to be. And he said Arabs would be an integral role, would play an integral role in that country. But what we realized was, because after the violence of the 1920s and then the revolt in 1936 that was ongoing, they said they don't want to live in a Jewish country. So the Peel Commission is put forward. And what do the British offer the Jews? They say, you know, the territory between the river and the sea, we'll give you 20% of it. The rest, about 75%, is going to go to the Arabs. We'll keep 5%, which is Jerusalem and a little territory out to the coast. And the crazy part, the Jews said, okay. We had a legally binding document in our hands, the British Mandate, that said that this whole territory was ours, legally. And then we compromised and we agreed to 20% of the land. What did the Arab leadership at the time say? The Arab Higher Committee, alongside Hajj Amin al-Husseini himself, right here in the British Mandate of Palestine, they said no. Not only did they say no, but they said, why do the Jews need a country? They said, why are you even thinking about giving the Jews a country? They're a minority here. King Abdullah in Transjordan chimes in saying, I should have that whole territory. And don't worry, the Jews will be autonomous within my territory. And don't worry, I'll protect them. And of course, that last little line, if you're Jewish, you probably snickered, because we stopped believing people when they said, we'll protect you. So the Peel Commission comes and we say yes and they say no. 10 years go by. And we all know what happens in those 10 years between 1937 and 1947. The most traumatizing years for the Jewish people, by far. And by the late 1940s, 46, 47, there was really nobody, at least in the Western world, and especially not in Europe, who could look at the Jews and deny the roots of modern Zionism, which was anti-Semitism is going to follow us. And really eventually became, and you're not going to protect us. In 1937, people could still look at us and say that we were paranoid, even though that 1,800 years of history before was plenty of evidence. But those 10 years changed it all. Because by 1947, nobody was able to look at us anymore and say, you don't need a country. Don't worry, we'll protect you. Really? Are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure you all just abandoned us. I'm pretty sure we just spent 6 horrific years with everyone telling us, no, sorry, go to the next guy. And no, I'm not just talking about the Europeans. I'm talking about the Americans who turned boats around, who wouldn't take in refugees. I'm talking about Canada. I'm talking about countries around the world. So the world got behind Zionism. At least the United Nations got behind Zionism. The world all of a sudden says, you know what? What the Jews have been saying for 50 years is true. We got to make this a reality. And so they propose another resolution. 1947 comes along and they say, let's offer another partition plan, just like 1937. And the UN this time, because the problem had been handed over to the UN by the British, the UN say, we'll give 55% of the land to the Jews and we'll give 45% to the Arabs. I'm not sure why they thought the Arab world was going to jump on this, because they'd offered the Arabs 75% 10 years earlier and they said no. And now they're offering them 45%. And they said no. Now, again, I've had this conversation with a lot of people. And a lot of times when I talk about the partition plan and when I talk about the Peel Commission, people look at me and they really defend the Arabs and they say, why should the Arabs have accepted giving the Jews any of this territory? Now, in the Peel Commission, it's a lot easier of an argument because we were about 25% of the population and we were being offered 20% of the land. With 1947, it's even more relevant because they were being given 45% of the land, even though they were a majority. The Arabs were the majority. So they say, obviously the Arabs said no. Obviously, what do you expect, right? Their land was going to be, 55% of the land was going to be given away to the Jews. And I always tend to say, you know, I get it, fine. Like, let's go with that. So what was their choice? Their choice was to accept a deal where they would have been guaranteed 45% of the land, or their other option. What was the other option? Well, there were multiple options. One was to try to continue to negotiate for more land, but they chose a different option. November 29th, 1947, the UN passes the partition plan. In the early hours of November 30th, they had made their decision. When they attacked buses on its way back from celebrating the British mandate, celebrating the partition plan, buses of revelers going from Netanya, going home to Jerusalem, and they were attacked by Arab militia now. Really encouraged by Hajj al-Husseini, who was in exile now in Egypt. And we went to war. And we won that war. And let's acknowledge something. That war was a war to annihilate us. And you don't have to take my word for it. And I know that sounds like a very extreme word, and I'm not one to use extreme words unless somebody else used them. And the lead of the Arab League, when sending in their forces, was calling it a war of annihilation. They decided to go to war. Now, what is war? Let's acknowledge something. When you go to war, what you are deciding is, I'm not going to accept that 45% that's a guarantee. I'm going to gamble. And they gambled with their own people. They gambled. And they decided, let's get it all. Let's just wipe out the Jews. It'll be easy. And they thought they'd have everything from the river to the sea. They lost. They lost. And we survived. And that's how Israel was born. And let's acknowledge who became the victims of that war that was started by the Arab world, by the Arab League. The victims became the Arabs who were living here, who eventually will become Palestinians. That's how my country was created. I didn't steal anyone's land. I was basically a refugee, basically someone who was looking for a place to go where I could be free and safe. And when we realized that the people living here didn't want to live in our country, even though we always said they would have equal rights no matter what, I get it. You want to live in your own country, that's fine. And we agreed to 20% in 1937 and then to 55% in 1947. And every step of the way they said no, and then they gambled. And now I'm being blamed for the gamble that they took. No. So I didn't steal anyone's land. You could not like the way that this all went down. You could believe that the Western world played too big of a role and it wasn't their place to pass the mandate or anything else. You can make those arguments. But the reality is that was the reality of that time period, whether you like it or not. Whether you look back in history and say it shouldn't have happened that way, there's nothing that I can do to change the history. But the Jews worked within the reality that they were living in to, in one of the most amicable ways, try to get a country without infringing on the rights of those living here. And it turned into war, not because we chose war, because they chose war. And again, not the people living here, but their leadership. So that's claim number one. That's claim number one. Claim number one, stolen land, colonialism, false. I'm not foreign to this land, I am indigenous to this land. When I came back and I bought land legally. I moved there legally. And through a legal process, I attained part of this territory. And then you chose war, and I attained a little bit more of it. That's how Israel was born. All right? Thanks to this guy right here, David Ben-Gurion. That's my man.